coffee is a very fussy plant. It likes specific temperatures, it likes specific rainfall, it likes specific altitudes. It can't be grown everywhere.
Welcome to our marine insurance podcast, Waves by Willis, a WTW business. This podcast series explores key topics and trending issues facing the maritime industry.
So the good news is we've been given another chance, and we're back with the second instalment of our supply chain specific podcast in the Waves by Willis series. I'm your host, Andy Edwards, and I'm joined once again by my colleague from the cargo side, Jacob Schauker, and our special guest for today's episode, Simon Lusher. Good morning, Simon.
Good morning, Andy. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Simon sits within our direct and fact team at Willis and specialises in risk transfer solutions throughout the food and beverage supply chain. He works across multiple lines of insurance, whether that be property, liability, contaminated products, including recall, or supply chain disruption. The list goes on, and I'm sure we'll discover a lot more of his capabilities over the next few minutes. So that's a very brief intro about our guest. And before we get talking, I'll give you a couple of facts about the specific subject matter we're going to be discussing. Each year, globally, we consume roughly 10 billion kilos of this. That's 2.25 billion cups a day. So with that, it will be no shock to you that this commodity is the second most traded in the world behind crude oil. And finally, and most probably well known in the insurance industry, is that Lloyd's is synonymous with this. As a result of the Great Fire of London in 1666, which saw much of the city destroyed, there was obviously a need for trade and commerce to continue. So where better to meet than in one of these establishments to do business? Edward Lloyd's shop by the river became the centre of marine intelligence and founded the modern insurance industry. If you've not worked it out yet, it's probably too early and you've not managed to get your hands on one. We're of course talking about the fascinating journey of one of the most well-known beverages in our daily lives, coffee. So that's enough from me. Let's get into it and hear from Jacob and Simon. So Jacob, I'll go to you first. Let's take it back to the start before we even get onto the supply chain and any of the risks associated with that. And let me ask you a really basic question. What is coffee?
Thanks, Andy. I think working in insurance like we all do, you can't escape coffee. It's absolutely everywhere. There's more and more coffee shops in London than ever before. But simply put, brew drink basically from roasted coffee seeds, commonly called beans, from the coffee plant. And there are many variations of that, most common being Arabica, which we'll probably be most familiar with, makes up around 60 to 65% of the global production. It's got a much smoother, sweeter taste. There's also Robusta, which contributes another significant proportion of that market, or slightly stronger, a bit more bitter and higher in caffeine. And of that coffee supply chain globally, obviously, like I say, a lot of it's exported from Brazil being the main contributor. It's around 35% of the coffee seeds come from Brazil. But there are massive contributors, particularly in Asia as well, with Vietnam, Colombia making up quite a significant proportion. I'll say Asia, obviously Colombia's not in Asia. Ethiopia and Honduras as well being two other big contributors of that. And it can be quite a complex and quite a drawn out supply chain, as I know Simon will touch on a bit more in a second. But from a risk perspective, lots of physical triggers, physical perils that the coffee beans will encounter along that supply chain journey. But like I said, I don't want to touch on that too much for the moment, because I think Simon can provide a bit more about the kind of wider supply chain and the current kind of state of the supply chain for the coffee industry.
Will do, Jacob, but I've got to congratulate you to start off with for saying seeds before you said beans, because they're not beans. We call them beans, but you're right, it's a coffee seed.
Yeah, I'll say that's on purpose.
I'm impressed.
So I touched on some of the countries where the main exporters are, but where does that coffee actually come from, and what does that supply chain actually look like?
Okay, well, you mentioned the main producers, and if you look at a map of the globe, you will notice that they're all in roughly the same kind of band around the equator in the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. And that's one of the issues we'll probably come to later, is that how narrow that band is, because coffee is a very fussy plant. It likes specific temperatures, it likes specific rainfall, it likes specific altitudes. It can't be grown everywhere, and it's this kind of band on either side of the equator. It used to be said that it was grown by developing nations and drunk by industrialized nations. And I think that's changed now as kind of developing and industrialized nations are kind of blending into each other, and as kind of Western tastes are kind of being picked up by kind of Southeast Asia, China, etc. So that's not quite as true as it was, but it's still broadly true. So that means we've got a long supply chain in that the countries that are drinking the most coffee are not the countries that are producing it. In terms of the actual supply chain then, we know where it's grown. The coffee plants take about 7 years to start fruiting. So there's a fairly long process of cultivation before we even start getting a product out of them. They then fruit for about 25 years. And the coffee berries usually produce two beans, or technically seeds, as we've discussed, which then need to be extracted from the fruit. And that is quite a complicated process these days. I mean, you can dry them, but that takes time. So what that usually happens is they get fermented and milled and hulled and cleaned, and that produces a green coffee bean. Or, and this is a very specialised coffee bean, you can feed them to Indonesian palm civets or Thai elephants, and their digestive system does the processing for you. And then hopefully they're cleaned after that, and you can sell your coffee at a very, very high premium. But that generally doesn't happen. Generally speaking, we are producing green coffee from a kind of a wet fermenting process, or drying them out and then kind of hulling them and cleaning them. So we've got green coffee beans. Now, green coffee beans store and travel much better than roasted beans. Once you roast a bean, you're on the flavour starts disappearing, and the aromatics start going quite quickly. So you're better off moving the green beans to the roaster rather than roasting them and then moving the roasted beans to the consumer. So that tends to get transported, usually bulk, so ships rather than planes, goes to the roaster. The roasting process basically produce the coffee you're going to drink. So that causes chemical and physical changes to the coffee. The flavour changes depending on the roasting time. So you then get grades of roast, dark roast, lighter roast. Arabica beans, that's probably going to be sold as ground coffee or whole beans. Robusta, the same, but Robusta is also further processed into instant coffee. And that's mainly because Robusta is cheaper to produce. So it makes sense to turn that instant coffee.
Is that also stronger, Simon, in terms of caffeine, Robusta?
It's about 50% stronger. Yeah, so you often see it in the kind of the Indonesian kind of Lava Java type coffee brands, the high caffeine, strong espressos. That's Robusta rather than Arabica.
So just on that, you sort of talked about how concentrated the production is globally. What sort of risk does that pose? You can talk about physical loss or damage here, or really like climate specifically. And have you seen any massive climate impacts in any of these countries in recent times?
Well, if you're buying coffee at the moment, you've probably noticed it's a lot more expensive than it was 5 years ago. And that's because in 2024, we had both drought problems in Brazil, so the coffee harvest was much lower. We had erratic weather, high rainfall, low rainfall in Vietnam, which also disrupted their harvest. So you've got a commodity shortfall, which obviously increases the pricing. And as a subject, you know a lot more about than I do, but you also had quite a lot of trade disruption in 2024 as well, which meant freight costs went up.
On the flip side of what you said in Brazil, they actually had some frost in 2021, which I wouldn't really think about. But I gather that caused some huge damage to some plantations and again impacted pricing.
Yep, that is true, and that's the problem when you've got a concentrated production. It's not spread out, and weather events, and you've got that equator band as well. So that is where kind of the erratic weather is, which is affecting all of us in terms of kind of the storms that come from that area and the ocean warming, etc. So yeah, we've got our coffee in a very erratic, to repeat that word, kind of weather system, and that's going to affect pricing. It's a very sensitive crop, as I said already. Of course, as I mentioned also, it's not grown where it tends to be drunk. So then you've got to ship it. And then you've got the cargo risks because it's a sensitive crop, but it's also a sensitive commodity. So it is vulnerable to light, temperature, moisture and oxygen. All can lead to deterioration during transit. So you've got to make sure it's suitably packed, and you've got to make sure you've got the right sort of containers for it. And it's also time sensitive. So any delay in transit and your green beans are going to start degrading over time, losing flavour and freshness, even when the storage conditions are optimal.
Okay, interesting. So you've talked a little bit about the climate there and the transportation of it. What are some of the other sort of industry challenges that are being impacted? So, you're looking at tariffs. I think just 2 days ago, more tariffs introduced for Brazilian coffee. There's obviously a geopolitics at the moment is massive. And as I said, we've touched upon climate change. But what is the impact of that US tariff on Brazil? And are you seeing those transits moving elsewhere or sort of predicted to move elsewhere?
So, the tariffs are interesting because coffee is in such high demand in the US. You kind of think it's still gonna get there. Now, whether it goes straight from Brazil and your average American spends more on his cup of coffee, that's quite likely. But I think you're also going to see a more complicated supply chain as kind of exports from Brazil and other countries are rerouted via countries that have got a kind of a better tariff regime with Trump's government. So that adds more complexity, and in another way, of course, it's going to add more expense as well, though perhaps not 30%.
I've got a question. It's a slightly different tangent on that, but when we purchase our coffee in the supermarket or in a coffee shop, we see a lot of the time the term fair trade. Can you just give me a bit more context as someone that's a bit more of a novice when it comes to the coffee industry into what that fair trade actually means for a coffee producer and the industry as a whole?
Yeah, we've just been talking about coffee crops shortfall because of droughts or erratic weather. But going back a bit further, I think it was 1988, we had the opposite effect. We had a kind of bumper harvests, and that led to a bit of a price collapse in coffee. And the ones that suffered the most from that was the farmer. So coffee production isn't highly, coffee growing isn't highly industrialized. There's about a kind of 100 million people worldwide that rely on it as their primary source of income, and they tend to be, because of the kind of the areas we've already talked about where coffee is grown, they tend to be in developing nations and quite poor. So when the coffee price collapsed, obviously they were getting paid less by the big coffee traders, and that led to some very difficult conditions for the individual farming families. So somebody came up with this great idea, and at the time, it still is a great idea, that if people would pay a premium for their coffee if they knew that the farmer was getting the benefit of that additional price. So that's where the fair trade movement came from. And that's still going relatively strong, but the pricing and coffee purchasing at the moment is changing. We've got this, they're described as the third wave, a kind of a movement, if you like, of specialty coffee retailers buying direct from single farms. So perhaps fair trade isn't as important as it used to be, but you're right, you'll still see that on packaging when you go into the supermarket.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because from a cargo insurance perspective, obviously we have, to be fair, it might be the same in the property insurance programs as well, but we have seen the growing implementation of the forced labour clause, particularly as insurers and syndicates focus on their ESG overall as a wider kind of initiative, which is obviously a good thing. So that essentially discourages insureds or buyers from benefiting or from utilising forced labour on any of their products throughout their supply chain. Otherwise, it could potentially not so much invalidate an insurance claim, but could lead to a scenario where insurers will withdraw their capacity if, in the event that forced labour has been found to be used in the production of the coffee or whatever commodity is applicable.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. And you're right to bring it up in relation to fair trade as well, because fair trade has kind of expanded out to be, kind of sustainable and ethical sourcing as well. But as a certain major coffee chain is discovering, that's quite difficult to manage sometimes, and that they are actually in the process of being sued by a consumer advocacy group for kind of misleading advertising, actually, because they're making 100% ethical claims. They ordered a certificate to a certain coffee farmer in Brazil, and then the Brazilian inspectors kind of turned up 6 months later and found children working there under the age of 13, very bad working conditions, etc. So, yeah, I mean, it's on everyone's agenda. It's difficult to police and maintain.
Yeah, and I think just on that, 70% of that child labour is in agriculture. So, not just coffee.
Yeah.
So unfortunately for the world, it is everywhere. And like you say, sort of drilling down on that is incredibly difficult to do, especially from here. Look, we've sort of talked about the landscape of coffee, where it comes from, what impacts it. Not to go into really detailed insurance conversation here, but parametric products are fairly relevant to farmers and exporters. And so, Simon, are there any sort of emerging insurance solutions specifically designed for the kind of smallholder farmers? For those, what is a parametric solution, probably as well?
Okay, so parametric insurance, I mean, it works very well for coffee because, as I mentioned before, coffee is sensitive to temperature and rainfall. So a parametric solution would be something that you're not insuring the coffee plant. What you are insuring against is rainfall. So whether that be too much rainfall or too little, that is the metric that you're measuring. So you set a limit on where the amount of rainfall you need and the amount of rainfall you get. There's a trigger there, and the policy will pay the difference. So if you've got a drought season and your coffee's dying, you're not being paid for the coffee loss, but you are being paid for the usually on a kind of a per millimetre basis, per millimetre of rainfall that you were expecting but that you didn't get. So if you've got a kind of a coffee commodity trader that wants to protect its smallholder producers, they can take out a policy for the farmers that they buy their coffee from, and those farmers will then get the benefit of the insurance when the rainfall isn't enough to grow the crop properly. And that could also be for temperature in terms of degrees. So it's quite versatile. You don't need to go to the farm. You can measure most of this by satellite. So the parametric that Willis has set up is satellite based. So they can tell without having to do any sort of loss adjusting or investigation that these farmers have suffered from a shortage of rainfall.
This is all quite high tech, isn't it? I mean,
all very high tech. So the payout is triggered automatically as soon as the policy period is over, and the farmers benefit from a cash injection that they wouldn't get because they weren't able to sell their crop because they couldn't produce it. So that keeps them going for another year, and hopefully the harvest is better the next year.
I think we've covered a fair amount here. We've probably talked for hours on this subject, and things are changing every day. I'm going to sort of wrap this up by asking you what your personal go-to coffee drinks are, and has an understanding or a better understanding that the supply chain and what's going on in it changed how you appreciate your cup. I work with Jacob regularly. I know his answer here, and for some reason he always whispers it. So Jacob, shall I start with you and just you tell me what you like to order?
Yeah, I think the context is I never used to drink coffee much when I was younger. I was more of a hot chocolate person, but I'm currently in the transition towards more coffee. So I do like a latte, but at the moment my go-to is a mocha, which still counts.
You know that mocha was the originally the name of a Yemenese port, right? And those beans had a chocolatey quality. So I
did not. So it's a very topical historical choice, actually. I'll remember that next time.
Simon, you look to me to be a kind of sophisticated cappuccino drinker. So are we sort of correct there, or?
No, you've got me completely wrong.
Oh.
I am basic. I am black espresso, and if I'm decadent, I put some water in it and make it a long black.
Very good.
Not an Americano. Americano's too watery. So yeah, strong and bitter.
Well, I've recently discovered cold brew, which is actually rocket fuel, so you can feel the palpitations the minute you sip that, and that's getting me going every day at the moment. So just to wrap up, Simon and Jacob, truly appreciate your insights and contributions to today's discussions. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. We're glad you joined us for this episode of Waves, our marine podcast series. See you next time.
Thank you for joining this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on marine insurance risk. WTW offers insurance-related services through its appropriately licensed and authorized companies in each country in which WTW operates. For further authorization and regulatory details about our WTW legal entities operating in your country, please refer to our WTW website. It is a regulatory requirement for us to consider our local licensing requirements. This information given in this podcast is believed to be accurate at the date of publication. This information may have subsequently changed or have been superseded and should not be relied upon to be accurate or suitable after this date. This podcast offers a general overview of its subject matter. It does not necessarily address every aspect of its subject or every product available in the market, and we disclaimer all liability to the fullest extent permitted by law. It is not intended to be, and should not be, used to replace specific advice relating to individual situations, and we do not offer, and this should not be seen as, legal, accounting, or tax advice. If you intend to take any action or make any decision on the basis of the content of this podcast, you should first seek specific advice from an appropriate professional. Some of the information in this podcast may be compiled from third-party sources we consider to be reliable. However, we do not guarantee and are not responsible for the accuracy of such. The views expressed are not necessarily those of WTW. Copyright WTW 2025, all rights reserved.